Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by Clear Company. Workplace accessibility isn't just about compliance with government regulations. It's about a human issue. And as human resource leaders, it's something that we should be thinking about. And I hope we're thinking about it a lot. This affects our physical space, but we also have to consider accessible technology for job applicants and our employees. Today I'm joined by Dr. James, or J.R. Harding, the go-to expert on issues and challenges faced by persons with disabilities in today's society. He is a disability expert, published author, policy influencer, and an industry consultant. He is a 2-time U.S. presidential appointee and a 7-time Florida gubernatorial appointee. JR teaches full-time at Florida State University. Dr. Harding, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Well, Jessica, thank you so much for inviting me. And to be honest, I'm a big fan of your podcast, your AI, accessible technology, labor market trends, and really your partnership with Pete. You guys are doing a priceless service to us in the community.
Thank you. And I know we've had several conversations about that. That's actually how we really connected. Before we dive into workplace accessibility, can you give us a little background into what led you to become a policy influencer at the state and federal level?
Thank you for the question. To be totally transparent with the audience, it was perhaps a selfish point of view. I wanted to get into the game of life. I wanted to get off of the sidelines and become an active participant rather than a passive observer. And at the time, the Americans with Disabilities Act had just passed. And my university at the time and my community at the time was like, oh my God, what are we going to do? We need people to help us assess our built environment, to look at our policies and procedures, and how do we create a more welcoming community, even if it meant coming through the side door. At least we were coming into the door for the first time. And that's really where it began. The establishment of a student group called Students with Alternative Needs, or SWANs. And there was 3 of us in a university with visible disabilities across the spectrum with different skills and functions and perspectives. And we founded this organization and got engaged in student government, got engaged in university policy, got engaged in community advocacy, and partnered with things like Centers for Independent Living, transportation, and so forth. From there, began to apply my education. Where was I going to live? How could I cover my bills? Where could I go to work? What was a meaningful place for work? Where was I otherwise qualified? Would my disability interfere with the essential job functions? All of these kinds of issues I was wrestling with in the late 80s and early 90s and began to apply that. My public policy background really took off as an intern in the state government's Office of the Governor's budget. And the first day on the job, the ladies running the office said, you need to read the state laws. And in the opening sentence, they talked about a board of regents or a governing body that oversaw all of the universities. And it stated that there shall be 1 student regent. And I was like, wow, wouldn't that be cool? How can I become the 1 student regent? Well, fast forward a year and a half later, I became the 1 student regent. in charge of not one university, but 10 separate public universities in the state of Florida. So I wasn't in the C-suite, I was above the C-suite.
I like that. I think we all want to be above the C-suite, right?
Right.
It's a great place to be.
And yes, it is. People return your phone calls. People listen to you. You get invited to all kinds of things. It's like instant friends, instant fame, but big responsibility. And while we were doing this, the timing was perfect because the university system was building an 11th university to meet the growing needs here in Florida, down there in Southwest Florida, a place called Gulf Coast University in Fort Myers. And because of my presence, because of my advocacy, we were able to build a universally accessible dynamic institution without the traditional barriers of some of our more historic universities. We were also then able to place students with disabilities into the strategic master plan of the university system in terms of funding accommodations, student life issues, student life, technology, sign language interpreting, and all the pieces that go with being excelling as a student in higher education. And from there, I got involved with a little bit more of state government and politics and some of our governors, which led to transportation, building code issues, the federal code, voting rights access, swimming pool access, cruise ships, outdoor accessibility, and so many other little pieces that touch on the everyday lives of people with disabilities. So that's kind of my backdrop. So in the middle of all of that, while I was already a quadriplegic from a high school injury, I then had a second injury while completing my dissertation at Florida State that I became even more disabled than I was previously. So I'm one of the very few, and perhaps the only living two-time quadriplegic that I am aware of. And so a lot of people ask, well, how did you get 7 appointments? How were you recognized by the president? It begins like anybody else would. You raise your hand. You say you want to be involved. You put forth that application. You build those skill sets. You get those experiences. And you sell the expertise that is within each of us to fill the gaps in knowledge and abilities that we need in society and businesses.
Well, thank you for giving us the background, and I appreciate you sharing your personal story, because I think that a lot of times people, I mean, we're on an audio podcast, so you sound fine to me. And a lot of people say, well, you don't sound like you have a disability. So can you talk to us about how this personal journey has impacted you as an individual in the workplace?
Well, thank you. Well, that's, I think, going back to the initial question of why did I get involved? Well, I went to college just like any other Harding boy would go to college, because that's the family history. You're supposed to go to college. But to be quite honest, what could I do? Where was a space that was accessible? Where would my skills, abilities, and passions best excel without having some of my limitations affect job performance? And education was that space. My capacity to communicate clearly, effectively, and with stories had no bearing because of my disability.
I know you mentioned the Americans with Disabilities Act at the beginning here. And in a lot of your work, you have an autobiography called ADA Adventure. Can you talk a little bit about, fast forward from that to the class that you teach on accessibility as part of the business curriculum program at Florida State University? Talk to us a little bit about the class itself and then how that started.
Well, absolutely. Well, first we have the two bits of autobiographies. One called Now What, which is coming of age with two separate disabilities. And the other part, living a full and active life because of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And all the little pieces from recreation to travel to marriage to community service and just simple engagement. So how does all of this relate going back to teaching class? Well, part of getting engaged, many communities have leadership programs. And the city of Tallahassee has Leadership Tallahassee, and the state of Florida has Leadership Florida. Both of those programs I was accepted to and graduated from. And these are competitive, demanding, but very fulfilling programs. And I was the first person with a significant disability to be admitted, enrolled, participate, and graduate from both. And being able to connect with all of these different community leaders, whether it was the owner of the coffee shop or a self-made individual started a multi-million-dollar business in his garage. These stories are true today. And in my leadership program, to be honest, the provost of Florida State University was in my class. And while she and I had not met until this program, I picked up on her when we were meeting each other in the kind of the big semicircle of introducing your new next friend and telling stories about folks. And she stood out because of the Florida State connection. And while we got a chance to meet later and stay in touch with one another, because it is about relationships, Jessica, I think you would agree. You have to be good at what you do, but you also have to have relationships. And I followed up with her one day and was asking, what are we doing about the 10% of students with disabilities in higher education? And how are we standing out as a best university, not the best, but the 18th best public university in the country for students in general? How are our students with disabilities faring in the marketplace in terms of their graduation and so forth? And she thought about it long and hard, and along with the president of the university, John Thrasher, who is a former legislator, former Speaker of the House. And he was Speaker of the House when I was regent. See, remember the circles and relationships going back and forth and showing the abilities by getting off the sidelines of life and getting out there. And they said, you know, we would like you to come and make a contribution. We'd like you to teach workforce inclusion. We would like you to help our business students, our engineer students, our music students across the curriculum get this space called persons with disabilities. Help them understand the ethos, the ethics, the behaviors, the common sense, the little tools that we really do for anybody, except for we forget that persons with disabilities are our friends or neighbors or brothers or sisters and members of our family. And so thanks to the dean and others here, we were able to create one of the very few classes that is unique and specific to business majors to broaden their understanding, their familiarity, and their capacity to be able to recruit, retain, promote, challenge, be enriched, and be benefited from the skills and abilities of persons with disabilities.
I love that you guys do this, and I think for many of, not all, but many of your students, this could be the first experience that they've had, probably their first experience ever with maybe just such a candid conversation. But thinking about employment and retention in the workplace for all, including people with disabilities, where they're able to ask some of those questions that maybe once they get into the workforce as a manager or leader, they feel uncomfortable asking or learning more about.
You're spot on, Jessica. Spot on. I can just still remember as you were raising this question, as I rolled into the classroom for the first day of today's semester, the eyes went wide open. It's not very often that individuals have an opportunity to engage professionals and experts in their subject area who happen to have disabilities. Most people within the disability space, not most, but many, hide in plain sight with invisible disabilities. And so many people aren't aware of the diabetic, right? With PTSD, mental health, perhaps it's seizures. These kinds of things are not, let's say, in your face. And I engage the students right away saying, when I was your age, if I chose to skip class, everybody knew. I'd show up the next day and the teacher would ask politely, but, not intending to be condescending, but are you okay? Implying that because I missed class, I must have been sick. And I said, no, I just had a hard night like everybody else and just didn't want to get up. And of course, that gets a good roar from the class. But in reality, most of these students have never thought about accessible items, don't know what reasonable accommodations are, have never been challenged in the practice of this area, but yet they're management students, HR students, and business leaders of all types. So this class really gets into not only the ADA, but how about the Rehab Act, the ABA, adaptive technologies, the interpersonal discrimination components. How does race, disability, and gender play in this environment? The evolution of the disability space, going from a medical model to more of a social model. International perspectives. What's happening here in America versus what's happening in Europe? What are the purposes behind international symbols? Why do we have certain built standards?
I think you're right. When I think about most managers, they just haven't been exposed to, or just not necessarily exposed, but the conversation around things like reasonable accommodation and the process for that in the workplace and what the law says and how we handle those kind of conversations. Most managers don't go through any training outside of the workplace to help understand or prepare them for these kind of situations that happen. And so HR is sort of responsible for educating, oftentimes, the leaders. And honestly, I will say that we don't do a very good job. It's sort of like those one-off conversations, and then we hear about it later, or we have to do an investigation. And that is, in my opinion, where a lot of the training happens, after some incident or some situation has occurred.
Right. After a situation or an incident has occurred. Why do we need to be reactive? Why can't we be proactive? And in our proactive actions, so many more things could go right, so you're not in litigation. You're not having to write a report. You don't have DOJ in your business. You don't have EEOC in your business. You're not paying a fine to someone who was overtly denied an opportunity to participate.
So, based on that, what are some ways that you feel like HR can be more proactive in these areas outside of taking your class,
Well,
which is a given, kind of in my mind?
right. Well, I think what's neat, though, is first, HR should always raise the accessibility and inclusion mantra, right? Because what's good for the disability community often, if not always, is good for those without disabilities. If you think about things like in the built environment, how many people with bicycles use ramps? How many baby strollers use ramps? How many skateboards use ramps? Right? How many of us have our hands full and we hit the power door assist to walk in? Many of us find the grocery store with the automatic doors just simply inviting rather than a sense of barriers and an obstacle course in life. I think HR can teach all the other components, whether it's marketing, whether it's the finance folks, whether it's the strategic planning. Are we getting our piece of that $500 billion of discretionary money within the disability community? Does our strategic business plan make sure we're getting a piece of this money? Or are we choosing to leave about 20% of the population on the sidelines? And that means 20% of the profits. And God knows how much innovation, creativity, and let's say trend setting that we're not being able to take advantage of because we don't have those extra eyes, ears, and abilities within our workspace.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you are listening to the Workology podcast sponsored by Clear Company. Today, we're talking about accessibility in the workplace with Dr. J.R. Harding.
This podcast is sponsored by Clear Company, the fastest growing talent management system on the market, and recently won G2 Crowd's #1 user recommended Winter 2018 award. Visit clearcompany.com to learn more.
I love what you're saying about how that the disability community or the passing of the Americans Disabilities Act didn't just help people with disabilities, but it has made for a more inclusive environment, whether it's as a consumer, as an individual, maybe going to your local library or going into an office and using an elevator or those doors, or as an employee who wants to come and work at an organization and wants to be able to get to their office from the point where they park and walk up the sidewalk into the building and then up an elevator or however type of transport they are getting.
Right. And I think to go a bit further, the Americans with Disabilities Act and the standards that are found within the architectural components, that's minimum standard, Jess. Okay, that's minimum compliance. Is any business about minimum compliance? Do they want to excel? Do they want to have that social consciousness? Do they want to be branded in the community for their diversity and inclusion? Or do they want to be recognized for negative issues?
Well, I would hope for a lot of different reasons they would choose the positive issues, but I also think about the increased media sharing and social media that's driving a lot of conversations, and then the employee experience or the candidate experience, like those kind of sharing or things that are shared as an individual they aren't just distributed like we used to in the old days where you would write a letter to the editor and it would be published in the local paper. You can do that very quickly. And I have several friends on Facebook. One of them that we've interviewed on the podcast previously, her name's Sassy Outwater. And she is an advocate for people with disabilities. She's sight impaired. And so she regularly gets on her soapbox and shares her experiences every single day. So those are the kind of things I think we need more of so that we can help improve our work experiences and our life experiences.
Well, yes, and there's a number of business cases for inclusion, right? Of fostering environments for dignity, advancing corporate values, helping gain that international reputation you're looking for, right? Promoting greater access to talents, right? Mitigating some of your turnover rates, solving those labor gap issues, right? Many people don't appreciate that people with disabilities are not necessarily running to the next job because they like their community. They respect and appreciate that employer who had the sensitivity, the wherewithal, and the skill set to bring them in. How about the markets? We talked about that, but the suppliers, the diversity, the customer loyalty, that brand, and then finally the positive social change that you alluded to earlier.
So let's talk about your take. So you have been very involved from the beginning on Americans with Disabilities Act, as you said earlier, minimum standards, right? So what kinds of things do you want to see in order to ensure there is an accessible atmosphere or culture, an environment for all job seekers and candidates? Like, give us your wish list. What do employers need to do?
Well, I'll start with the way they advertise. Are they put out in accessible formats? Are those fill me out on templates accessible to adaptive technologies? Almost on a daily basis, I'll run across websites or the illegible fill out documents that my drag and dictate cannot interact with. And then all of a sudden, so I can't spend my money or I can't offer my opinion, my skills or abilities there. I think holding your contractors, your architects, and your other construction-oriented folks accountable when you're renovating your space or you're building new space, that you apply the universal design principles, that you have open hallways, that you have the wider doorways, that we can use every entrance, not just 50% of the entrances, that perhaps maybe going that extra mile of even creating more accessible bathroom environments that have more tools, or perhaps there's a break room could use rather than having to go home, right, and then return back to work. I think a critical piece is forming partnerships with our not-for-profit community supporters, our CILs, our technology folks, our independent living, our disability rights, your vocational rehabs, your blind services, because those are, in many senses, programs and organizations only known to the community of people with disabilities, rather than your HR leaders, for someone to come in and assess what are some of the barriers in your workspace. What could you work on every single year to continue to tear down some challenges that might be found within your workspace? The other day I was in Hawaii, and the power doors on one of those quick serve restaurants, I won't name it because I shouldn't, but I was touched because I can't tell you how many times I get stuck sometimes going through the double set of doors at a burger joint. You know, you come in, you make that 90-degree turn to the left and go through another set of double doors.
Yep.
Right. Well, really, quite frankly, just why? And I was just touched by this quick serve burger joint that had power doors on the side of the building. I took a picture and loved it, and went inside and paid a little too much because location. But you know what? It drew me in. I spent my money, and it was a great experience.
It's the little things that, I take for granted and you're talking about that go a long way.
Right. So one of the other things I think that's really neat, and something that organizations and HR folks could do, is why not provide the young folks with disabilities, and even some of the older folks with disabilities, an opportunity for those internships, mentoring opportunities, trainings, so that they can not only get in to an entry-level position, Jess, but move up the food chain.
Yeah.
Right. Just like anybody else. We all have a trajectory where we see ourselves in 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years. Well, that should be no different for anybody on your workforce team. And any kinds of opportunities to travel, to do sales, to participate in the training, to make that training, to get those certificates, to make you better at your job should be available to all persons with or without disabilities.
One of the things that you and I have talked about in our initial kind of conversations when we were kind of putting together the framework of this podcast was about recruiting people with disabilities. And I know you've talked about some of the ways that you feel like corporate America is falling short. We talked about career sites and the experience, and then providing them with, an opportunity to travel and, have a normal hiring and recruiting experience that not necessarily normal, but is inclusive and accessible to everyone. But I wanted to talk to you about something that I am seeing a lot of these days, and it's disability-specific hiring and kind of recruiting programs. For example, there's a lot of autistic-specific recruiting programs that are out there. Do you think that's the answer to recruiting people with disabilities, or is there something else?
I think, well, that's a great question, and a much broader, I think, in the whole disability space of what's going on with our voice and how are we moving in terms of public policy and opportunities. I believe that some members of the developmental disability community have been some of the last to benefit from the Americans with Disabilities Act and getting folks out of institutions, being able to live in the community and so forth. I think it is about skills, and there are many on the spectrum who are uniquely qualified to do numbers, coding, and so forth. And I think since we're such a text-driven society now, having individuals who find that work to be very passionate, very fulfilling, and they happen to be very good at it, I think is a way for companies to tap talent, use talent appropriately, and reward talent appropriately. But then what about individuals with blindness? What about individuals with some mental health issues? What about individuals with significant mobility challenges? What then are those opportunities or like opportunities not available because you're not the flavor of the month? So I think that is a broader challenge as we move forward. How do we ensure equity and equal opportunity and not carving out unique spaces just for certain disability groups? There still needs to be a level of merit, a level of competitiveness, and a level of accountability. We don't want to get into the quota system because quotas often create some negativity around it and often don't really meet the needs of an organization.
I appreciate your perspective here. And one of the reasons I ask is because I'm seeing a trend with these disability specific kind of programs. And we have a listing on the Workology site that's one of our top 10 most popular articles. And it is simply a listing of autism hiring programs in the US. But I like what you're saying here, that it doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't have those, but that you should have different programs or different ways for all types of individuals to be able to apply and be interviewed and ultimately, hopefully, selected and hired in a variety of roles in the organization.
Absolutely. And, and in some senses, someone with autism or another form of developmental disability may be uniquely qualified for a particular skill set. And the truth is, I don't have the patience or the eye to find code breaks.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But someone else may have that. But at the same time, maybe they need someone who is a great trainer, a great facilitator, the capacity to do sales. Right. Some people often joke with me, I should have gone into sales. I could get, someone to buy sand who lives in the desert. But that's not always the case. It's really believing in yourself, knowing what you know, and bringing consistent passion, honesty, and integrity and effort every day.
Let's talk a little bit about adaptive technology, because we talked about that kind of in the beginning of the podcast, and you talked about a little bit about how it was important, but you have a unique perspective in that your career really spans, I'm saying you're experienced, but over the time period that, the Americans with Disabilities Act and kind of the trend to, and really, not really a trend, but just more organizations and technologies starting to add adaptive technology into their tech stack, and we just have more options than ever before. Can you talk about what's coming next? What do you see on the horizon when it comes to adaptive tech?
Well, I see a lot of independent living tools, right? Advanced mobility devices. How does driverless cars work for you, Jess? And how does driverless cars work for those who are chair-bound?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because you know what? Then you need to tie in a locking mechanism and a securement piece. So would we actually need still to have a driver or an attendant somehow? Maybe it's the complete automation and voice control of the home. And those systems started with many of us in the early 80s of having switches to be able to turn on the lights or open the door or the TV remote, right? The universal remote controls. Perhaps it's the navigation systems built into our wheelchairs, right? Maybe my iPhone is attached to my joystick on my wheelchair rather than in a separate appendage that's attached to you.
Mm-hmm.
How about airplane transportation? Maybe there's some changes there. There are many who are trying to advocate to allow us to fly from our mobility devices. Could we easily interact with our touch devices more clearly with voice rather than having to use our hand? Like often you get in your car, Jess, and you use your Bluetooth, I would assume, yes?
I do.
Right. Well, doesn't that require you switching the little switch on the side of your phone to activate it to the car?
Yeah, and if you don't have fingers that are agile, it's not a voice-activated option yet.
It's not a voice-activated option. So that workaround, in my case, I have an old flip phone that's hidden in my book bag, that is then connected to my car Bluetooth. So now I do have voice activation in the car. I think that as we continue, though, to run to smaller, quicker, more high powerful, I think some members of the disabled community and a great number of the elderly members of the community are running into manipulation challenge. You can't see it or you can't feel it.
Yeah.
I think we're going to continue to see advancements with text-to-speech and speech-to-text. I think maybe we might see proximity switches, maybe we'll put inside bodies that would automatically open doors, pay for a transaction at the store, allow you to go through TSA because they know you're a citizen. I think whatever you could imagine is a possibility.
Well, JR, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. This has been really enlightening, as I knew it would. I did want to ask, where can people go to connect with you? Where's the best place to do that?
Well, they can do it at floridastate.com through our website, or they can FSU EDU, or they can find me on LinkedIn, or even my personal website at jrharding.com. Again, that's jrharding.com. And I just can't thank you enough for your work in this space, your compassion to see change, and really your research and investigation on how accessibility, sensitivity, and people make a difference.
It's that human connection and human resources that I really feel very strongly about. We will link to your website, you on LinkedIn, as well as books and other information, including the Florida State University website as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us.
Yes. Well, and before you go, maybe I think a little bit on the HR space, if you still got your recorder going.
I do.
Let's transform HR from the disciplinary people, the compliance people, to the human folks. When they hire Jessica, you know what? She may have an aging parent. She may have a nephew with special needs. She may have a son who has autism. Maybe Jessica can't show up at 9 o'clock. HR can help that manager understand that it's okay for Jessica to show up at 9:15 and she's going to stay till 5:15. Maybe JR needs to bring food and drink into normal space that doesn't generally allow food or drink because I need to watch my sugar level. Maybe HR is aware and has relationships with those community partners I was alluding to earlier, so that then you know what kinds of resources are out there. So we're an extended family at your place of work, and you look after your folks, and especially during times like emergencies and natural disasters that are coming more and more frequent.
I love it. It's the family sort of human connection and a workplace culture that's really focused on those personal connections and those relationships between HR and managers and team members that I think will really drive this new inclusive work environment where we're all in this together. We have different stops along the way, but we're all in it to be able to provide for ourselves and our families and have a little fun along the way.
Right. And I think one of the things, I don't know if there's value in this last little piece before we go, but I'm challenging some of my students to look at some of the accessibility that are found in Title III and Title II properties and say, hey, does this make sense? Do the standards really, are they being implemented in the spirit that you think they should? Is that path of travel right? Does that door actually work? is it too heavy? When you come into a space, is the accessible part of the counter right there in the middle, or is it hidden over there in the corner? How would that make you feel? Or then you go over to that accessible counter, Jessica, at the hotel, right? And guess what? The staff person behind the desk tells you, would you come back over to this counter because this computer isn't even on or functioning right now? Or rather than using that as a functional space, you've got flowers and advertisement, and it's now a place for furniture and messaging rather than an actual counter for transactions. And then finally, I'm challenging my students to use adaptive technology, Jessica, in everyday life situations, like filling out an application. Do they know how to use a screen reader? What is it like to have someone else take your notes? Could you walk around a campus without sidewalks with curb ramps? How would that affect your time to distance? Or using public transportation to get around like so many other individuals in the community.
These are all important things for us to consider and think about, and I appreciate you helping me bring those to light.
I'm so pleased to be able to talk with JR about workplace accessibility. If we want to truly be inclusive in our hiring efforts and in our workplaces, we have to go beyond compliance and start creating an accessible hiring process and accessible employee experience. We also need to have leaders and managers who understand workplace accessibility and what that means. JR is truly an inspiration, and I highly recommend taking a look at his website, which I'll put in the show resources. JR, thank you for taking the time to come and talk with us and discuss accessibility candidly and openly with us today. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast sponsored by Clear Company. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill. Until next time, visit workology.com to listen to all our previous podcast episodes.